Good afternoon and thanks for joining us. This is our first in a series of Alt Talks, where we bring leaders in the industry together to share their views, their vision, and discussion about opportunities in the global cannabis industry. My name is Charles Taerk. I'm president of Faircourt Asset Management. We are the portfolio advisors to the Ninepoint Alternative Health Fund, Canada's first actively managed mutual fund that has a focus in the cannabis space. And very proud to say that we're Canada's top performing mutual fund for 1 year. That's according to Morningstar Canada. Ninepoint Partners is the sponsor of this Alt Talk. Ninepoint is an independent investment manager committed to adding value to investors' portfolios while helping advisors to differentiate their businesses. Joining me today are Peter Aceto, CEO of CannTrust, and Greg Engel, the CEO of Organigram. Some background on both gentlemen. Peter Aceto is the CEO of CannTrust and has been CEO since October 1st of this year. Previously, he served as president and CEO of Tangerine Bank, formerly ING Bank. That was from 2008 until 2017. Prior to that, he was a founding member of the senior leadership at ING Bank and served as executive vice president, head of credit, chief lending officer, chief risk officer, chief of staff, and chief sales and marketing officer of ING from March 2002 through to and including April 2008. He currently serves as a director of ING Direct Asset Management and Tangerine Bank. He also serves as a mentor and advisor to several Canadian startups in the fintech space. In community involvement, Peter's also a board member of the Sinai Health System Foundation, a board member for Unity Charity, and a member of the Council of Governors of iCanada, dedicated to helping Canada become a world-leading intelligent nation. Welcome, Peter.
Thank you.
Greg Engel. Greg has been a CEO of Organigram since March of 2017. He's a senior executive with 30 years of national and international experience in the pharmaceutical, biotechnology, cannabis, and consumer packaged goods industries. Previous to his tenure at Organigram, Greg was the CEO of Tilray, where he guided the company to become the first Canadian exporter of medical marijuana, as well as establishing several industry-leading standards. He graduated from the University of Guelph with an honors Bachelor of Science degree in microbiology. Welcome, Greg.
Thanks.
Thank you, both of you, for joining us. So what we're going to do today in our 1 hour session is we're going to divide the hour into 3 sessions, 3 separate areas. First, we're going to reflect on the opening of the domestic recreational market and discuss early results and the opportunities that licensed producers have to expand their production and expand their brands across Canada. Next, we're going to look at opportunities in the global market. And finally, we're going to discuss some company-specific initiatives and take some questions from you, our viewers, in your offices. If you have any questions for any of the guests, please enter them to the left of your console. We will be able to address as many questions as possible throughout our session. So thanks very much for joining us. Let's begin. Greg, I'm going to start with you. And we've had a few tumultuous weeks in the recreational market in Canada. Wanted to get your initial reactions, both from Organigram's perspective and looking at some of the reports that you've seen as exit surveys, customer satisfaction, and the like.
Yeah, so it's been an exciting time. I mean, certainly there was a build-up till October 17th, and Organigram's position, we're a national provider. We're really present in most provinces with the exception of Quebec. And what we've seen, and I've had a chance to visit retail stores in Atlantic Canada in particular, and I think there's been a real positive sense of, the diversity of the customer base and the people that we're seeing in the retail environment. It's every demographic and every age group. And there's been a lot of excitement. I mean, there certainly have been some reports and some issues around supply challenges that companies have faced. And, I think that is a learning curve that is going to happen in any new industry as it ramps up. We have repeatedly said as a company and as an industry that it is going to take a couple of years for supply to catch up with demand. I think the positives have been, the demand's been overwhelming. There's been excitement, and I think we're continuing to see improvements in systems and how retailers, and I would particularly comment, again, Atlantic Canada and Western Canada, where we're seeing retail stores operating. The whole environment there is really positive, and the staff are trained well, and the whole experience for consumers is very positive, and it puts onus on us as an industry to continue to ramp up our supply and get product out the door.
Right. Peter, a similar question. Both of you operate in many provinces. What are some of your reflections on the first few weeks?
Yeah, I would certainly echo the comments that I just heard in terms of what we're hearing from the stores, and we are hearing a lot, in the news about some supply chain issues and some real criticisms about that. It's funny, at CanTrust, we expected, this is a brand new industry, a brand new time, and the whole world is watching, and I don't think that anyone should be overly surprised with some of the challenges we've seen in the first few weeks. So certainly we've seen some of those challenges, but we've also heard some really, really positive news from the people on the front line in the stores, province to province, talking about certainly our products and the things that are available. So for me, I think it's very, very early days and very, very exciting days. And I know with certainty that as an industry, whether it's the regulator, whether it's the LPs, the consumers in general, everyone in the supply chain, we will work this through, and it will be much smoother in the quarters ahead.
Right. When you look at the different provinces, it's not to single any province out. There's been some logistical challenges. There's been some timing challenges. What do the producers do in response for reshelving and restocking? How long is it going to take before, as an example, the SAQ stores are open 7 days a week and the OCS is back to full capacity? What is it going to take?
Well, I can tell you from our perspective, we basically do a daily triaging activity where what we have and who we plan to send it to and all those types of things are decided on a daily basis based on the information that we have from our medical business first, but then also where we are from a supply perspective to our provinces. So unfortunately, with this state of change and a flux and uncertain supply and demand, well, certainly the demand's actually there, we triage this on a daily basis and figure out who's getting what when, and we're trying to get product out as efficiently as we possibly can because we don't want to disappoint anybody.
Sure.
Yeah, a couple things. So we do the same thing, kind of daily triage planning. We've actually gone to 24/7 packaging now as well. So we had biological assets and buildup of inventory, and certainly everyone went through some hurdles in the early days of automation and packaging. You're going from filling individual orders and packaging for a small number of patients on a daily basis to shipping skids, right? So it's a monumental shift in terms of industry. So, and it took time for that automated systems to get up and running at full capacity, which at our facility they are now. And so, but even we're getting ahead of that in terms of making sure, because we are seeing a unique opportunity where, the amount of product we have available and the amount of product we can supply the market, where other companies, have not been able to meet their commitments, we have an opportunity in the near and midterm to really take advantage of that product need. So there's been instances in parts of the country, and I've seen it personally, where our product has been the only product on the shelves of any company at times. And, that's concerning, I think, from the operator's perspective, but I think, it shows confidence in us and kind of our ability to deliver. But, I think the whole industry has continued to go through this process, and I think, everyone has a continuous improvement that they have to meet up. But, we are seeing some separation in terms of who's performing and who's not, and I think that's going to continue.
Right. Just looking at the difference between recreational customers and medical patients, there's been some concern that the patients have been forgotten in the rollout to rec. Are you seeing patient pushback rather than customers? Are the medical patients concerned about adequate supply?
So at CanTrust, medical has been the core to who we've been, in the last 5 years, although we are now increasingly focused on recreational as well. So yes, our patients express concern in advance. And we have had some challenges meeting all the needs of our medical patients, but we've been very clear that we want to prioritize our patients and have demonstrated that. Some of the issues in the entire supply chain are not ones that we have complete control over, and that has actually had an impact on our patients as well. But we've tried very hard, and I think our patients would agree to provide excellent communication, as much transparency as we possibly can, and to really help them. I mean, the majority of our patients really are patients, and they really do need cannabis for medical purposes, and we need to be there for them because it's medicine to them.
Right. Yeah, we were talking before we came on air that maybe there's some skepticism on the part of people in the public that this really isn't medical, that they were using the medical excuse to get product, but they were just using it for rec. But there really is a difference in the dosage, in the formats that they're going for, and in the chemical composition of the medicine versus the rec deliveries, correct?
Yeah, we're seeing, so we had allocated product for medical patients to make sure they had a consistent supply, and we've been able to meet our patient demand. So very proud of that, and our patients are, still getting consistent access to product. And we had anticipated that, the potential would be a bit of a slowdown. Maybe some people move, but we're not seeing that. We're actually seeing growth in our medical patient base. Now, part of that could be, patients are now able to move their medical documents from one company to another, and the fact that we have a continuous supply for medical patients has been a big positive, and we've seen people transition to us. But I think, as Peter said, it is a different patient population, right? I mean, predominantly our medical patient population is oils. I know that's the case for CannTrust as well. Predominantly within that oil group, it's a high CBD product, right? So they're not looking to go to the rec market. Although what's interesting is, and Charles, you and I have spoken about this before, is that we see a huge demand for CBD in the recreational market, and certainly there's a lot of people that may have not been comfortable having a conversation with their physician. Their physician may have not been comfortable prescribing a medical document. They understand the potential benefits of CBD from a lot of the media coverage over the years, and they're looking to, access that product in the recreational market. So we're certainly ramping up CBD production for the recreational market as well.
Right.
Yeah, certainly building on that. I mean, we've seen a similar thing with CannTrust. I mean, we closed the quarter with 50,000 medical patients, and in the month and a half since, I mean, we have over 53,000 patients. So we've seen actually that space grow, and I think a lot of it is attributed to talking about cannabis in a much more public way. I mean, we've seen athletes come forward talking about CBD as a way to manage pain, and it's really a part of the conversation. So I think it probably is actually putting pressure on physicians to, with their patients coming to them saying, "Hey, let's talk about cannabis for the first time." And we've got doctor training and physician training capabilities to really try and help prepare them for those conversations, and so that we can be, a reliable partner of them, of theirs.
Looking years ahead, I know that in Europe, CBD is sold as a food supplement. Doesn't necessarily have to get prescribed by a physician. Do you see that taking place, given that CBD is non-psychoactive, and you've got WADA, you've got the World Health Organization, the UN, everybody seems to be more in support of delisting it as a banned substance. Do you see CBD showing up more and more in more regular consumer stores than just the dispensaries?
Yeah, potentially. I mean, certainly I was just in Europe a week ago and spent a week and kind of, spent a lot of time in different markets looking at, and you see CBD is routinely available in drugstores, in pharmacy stores, and natural health product stores. So it's more of a nutraceutical product there and is widely used, and people are self-treating for the potential benefits of CBD. And I think, as you said, there's been lots of changes, like with WADA making the change, take it off the banned substance list. It is on the agenda right now for the for the WHO, and we had hoped that the UN would kind of come out with a position with the INCB meeting in March. That may get delayed out a little further, so I'm not sure if that's actually going to happen in the near term, but I think over time, absolutely, we're going to see kind of the position of CBD change. And CBD as a source product, we know now with the changes, a lot of people don't talk about this, but one of the significant changes in the Cannabis Act is that hemp production and the availability of CBD through hemp production in Canada is now allowable. Yeah. And I think there's going to be, and there will be a lot more access to CBD kind of going forward. And I think that's a market that we're certainly looking to take advantage of, and I know other companies are as well.
Yeah, both of you have entered varying degrees of CBD production to supplement your cannabis. So we'll get to that later on.
Okay.
But wanted to take a step back. We're getting questions in, which we really appreciate. Reflecting on the brands, it's only been a month. One of the challenges has been that there really isn't any brand awareness, and even some of the exit surveys from the dispensaries are that people don't necessarily remember what brand they're buying. Mm-hmm. They know the THC and or CBD makeup of the product. How do the brands establish themselves given the regulatory environment? That's really going to be a challenge, because although distribution is going through the alcohol channel, the branding seems to be very similar to the tobacco channel. And how do we get appropriate branding, appropriate marketing, appropriate awareness such that people get to feel comfortable?
Yeah, well, look, I certainly have a view, from my past experience, having some experience in multiple countries, building a brand from scratch. Building a brand takes a long time. It takes a lot of investment. It takes a lot of time. It requires people to understand your product and talk to their friends and family about your product and about your organization. So, firstly, it's an interesting conversation. It's not a surprise to me at all that after a month, that there isn't a tremendous amount of brand awareness. And what I'm saying is in a fairly unrestricted environment. So today we're quite curtailed about what we can talk about from a branding perspective. Right. So I think these things take time. Mm-hmm. And as people become more familiar with the companies and become more familiar with the products, and as restrictions peel away slowly, we'll all have the opportunity to build brands and things I think will be clear in the marketplace about what we all stand for and what our brands are. So I think we need a little bit more time. But certainly the rules and regulations around marketing really curtail how that is going to happen.
Right. But there are opportunities, right? So our approach has been very much to work with whether or not it's a private retailer or a provincially around Crown Corp store, spend a lot of time and energy on training and making sure that the staff in the store understand the products, how your products differentiate, what your brands are. We actually did an extensive consumer typical CPG type market research on development of our brands when we came up with the Edison Cannabis Company and Anchor Organics and some of our other brands. We were testing those concepts with consumers, right? And I think that's critical to understand, who is your demographic, who are you targeting with the brand, and then, ultimately at the end of the day with any brand, your brand has to fulfill on the promise, right? Does the brand resonate with people? Do you fulfill on the promise of what you represent? Our brands represent quality, so it's critical to us that the quality side of what we're putting forward as a brand is executed on, and that people have that experience. It was interesting. I don't know if you saw a couple days before, on the 15th of October, CBC National ran a piece on kind of brand development. So they featured ourselves in MedRelief and looked at kind of different approaches on brand development. And they followed our team for 9 months in creating the Edison brand. And I think one of the things that was interesting in that was, through that, the regulations, as Peter alluded to, were changing and evolving. Right. We were getting different guidance, so we were having to shift and make changes throughout the process. But I think ultimately it does come down to what's the consumer experience. But we've got POS materials in stores, we've got digital media in retail, and I think it is, it's one of the challenges with Ontario right now. It is more challenging to build a brand online. Sure. So having only an online presence is more difficult. But as Ontario moves to private retail stores in the future, there's going to be an opportunity to build brands as we're doing elsewhere in the country.
Right. So one of the things we've done that's a little bit different in terms of building a core competency is we have a partnership with Kindred, which is a subsidiary of Breakthrough Beverages. So these are the number one distributor of alcohol products in Canada. So they understand the retail stores, they understand the people in stores who have to face the customer, and the education piece is absolutely critical. So we found that partnership in very, very early days to be very, very helpful, because they've got this core competency of how to teach people at the point of sale about products, particularly ones that are brand new, and what they stand for, and those types of things. So we're certainly interested to see how that plays out.
Right. Just going to a cultivation question. Both of you are growing cultivation, indoor, greenhouse, outdoor, starting soon with the Niagara facility. Greg, you had made mention there's going to be undersupply for some period of time. Everybody is building cultivation, but there's going to be a point. How long before that happens?
That's a challenging question. I mean, I guess I'd make 2 points on that. One is, our strategy to continue to build out with indoor was to continue to focus on that high-end quality market, and we're really the only company that has built out solely with indoor and has taken that approach, because we know that from a price perspective, we continue to see premium pricing in markets like Colorado, where the low-end and mid-range products have had price compression, right? So that's part of our strategy. Fortunately, at the same time, we've been so effective and efficient at it. We've got one of the lowest cost of goods, the lowest reported cost of goods in the market right now, in terms of publicly traded companies. But we have seen challenges with execution with many companies, and many companies have put out forward-looking statements about building out, and they're not necessarily hitting those timelines. So, I think if you'd asked this question a year ago, everyone would have said it's 3 years to 4 years. 6 months ago, people were saying, oh, it may only be 18 to 24 months. I would actually say it's more back to the latter now. It could still be that 3+ years, because it is challenging. People are reporting, we saw last week in some of the earnings calls, people talking about lower yields than expected with some of their build outs, lower quality. So again, that's, our approach is to make sure that we build out with what we know. But, there are some challenges there. And I think, we all have to consider the market's going to change dynamically next year as well as we go into derivative-based products, right? And companies are going to have to make decisions as to what product you're converting, what are you routing into that? And I mean, we've already been building excess extract up, right, and storing it as a concentrate because it doesn't degrade over time. Right. Now that we're seeing demand in the oil market, we're actually shifting to more oil production because there has been so much rec demand. But we had already been starting to build up inventory, even though it's 12 months out, starting to build up concentrated inventory for that market. And I think that's where one of the challenges is going to be. At what point do companies start to convert product or start to move product into that prep? Because, again, we've seen challenges moving from a small medical market to a large scale rec. Those challenges are going to be even more compounded next year when we move into a bigger range of products. Right.
So. Well, I don't think a lot of people appreciate planned capacity is not current capacity.
Right.
Lots of people have planned capacity, lots of money on their balance sheet, but they don't have plants.
Right.
They don't have flower. And that's really important to decipher. You've got to look at current capacity, and then a year or so from now, when edibles and drinks and all the other higher value products come out, there's going to be a further diversion of supply to that. So it means that we could be undersupplied for quite some time.
For quite some time, for sure.
Yeah. A couple of questions. We've received a couple. One question looking at CBD beverages rather than the alcohol replacement beverages, and will CBD beverages be a bigger market than dried bud?
Well, it's an interesting question. I think right now we see dried bud as pretty key in the early days of the recreational market. But I think in the end of the day, it's that's going to be for a fairly unique niche user in the end of the day. When you think about the potential for cannabis to be ubiquitous, right? I mean, you asked a question earlier about, I think you said we'll talk about it later.
Right.
About CBD as an ingredient, in possibly in our orange juice and the things that we drink as just like an omega-3 or something along those lines. And certainly at Cantrust, we see that as a very viable possibility. By the way, when we were talking about CBD, China is one of the largest growers of hemp in the world, and are already, so we're looking at the Asian market as well, and certainly CBD is a gigantic opportunity, right. A gigantic opportunity there as well. So with what we're calling, well, not just us, Cannabis 2.0, or the new rules and new regulations that are going to allow for edibles. I think that, dry bud is going to be a relatively niche market.
It's going to become less and less important.
And will be a small fraction of the whole cannabis market.
Yeah, although I think it's still, when you look at a mature market, if you want to call Colorado mature, they're 4+ years in, 5 years, it still makes up a pretty significant portion of the 20-25% is kind of premium flower, and that is part of the market. But, I think to answer your question, there's one caveat that you have to consider is the question you asked earlier about where does CBD fit. Is CBD restricted for distribution through the current channels as we grow out in terms of private and public retailers, or does it become a true more nutraceutical product and you see broad distribution in grocery and areas like that? Because that gives you access to a greater population. Not that people won't go to the cannabis retailers, whether they're private or public, but I think it will have an impact in terms of the market penetration, especially when you're talking about beverages, as to where it is carried and how it's carried. As I said, when you go to Europe and you're going through, really most of Europe, you see it routinely available, and that market is, there is a continuous lack of supply of CBD in the European market right now because their demand is so high, right? So I think there's a phenomenal opportunity for CBD as a place in the market, is it a food additive even? Does it start to have a place in other foods?
Sure.
So.
Great. And thank you very much, everyone, for sending in your questions. We're going to get to all of them. We want to take the next phase. We're going to start talking about the global market. So outside of Canada, there's a growing market. 40 countries now have some form of legalization for medical purposes. That represents an addressable market of well over 1 billion people. We want to examine the opportunity for the leading Canadian licensed producers. And we marvel at seeing where the Canadian companies have expanded. Both Europe, South America, parts of the Middle East, South Africa, Australia, all over the world. Some people are looking at the opportunity as being limited because one day, it's not an if, but a when, larger, well-capitalized U.S. entities will be federally regulated and allowed to go global. Do either of you worry about that? Look at it as a positive opportunity, and where are the next big markets for Canadian LPs? Peter?
Well, we think, for CanTrust, again, with its focus on medical, see global expansion with a medical focus as a key fundamental part of our strategy. Now, we're doing it very thoughtfully. So today we have relationships in Denmark, in Australia, in the Netherlands, and we're exploring others as well, because we see this as a significant opportunity, and that Canadians as first movers have the opportunity to be a part of teaching the rest of the world about this and about how it works. And certainly the structures we're using are very much joint ventures where we have people in market who are local and speak the local language and know the local players, sharing our intellectual property and standard operating procedures, so we build something together in that marketplace. So that's a model we're very optimistic is going to be one that will persevere. The fact that the Americans may have federal legalization in the not too distant future is something that we're certainly keeping our eyes on from an opportunity for us from an international perspective, but seeing it as something to be worried about ultimately hasn't really entered our thinking. We've just are thoughtfully, aggressively trying to take leadership positions in key countries around the world.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, a couple things I would add to is certainly, we've seen our investor base in the United States grow dramatically, right? The interest that's happening in the U.S. In terms of the space. And certainly Canadian companies are uniquely positioned. We're doing things at a scale that no one in the world is doing, right? And that's one thing you have to keep in mind as we look at kind of building businesses elsewhere. And we've taken a very similar approach to CanTrust in terms of, joint ventures and target companies in Germany. The company that actually CanTrust has equity and now an ownership of in Australia has been our distribution partner, right? And we continue to supply that company in Cannatrek in Australia. And we've taken a very measured approach in terms of let's target markets. We've got an equity investment in a German company as well, Alpha Cannabis, and we're part of the tender process going forward. We're looking to export to Germany as well. But I think when you look at the global market, Canadian companies, as I said, are doing things at a different level than U.S. companies, and we are able to access U.S. capital, right? And I think that's one of the keys that, we have seen certainly a number of U.S. companies do RTOs on the CSE here, and kind of certainly have had very success. Some of them have had successful RTOs, some others not so successful.
Right.
But in terms of, when you look at where we are globally, I think Canadian companies are very uniquely positioned, right? I mean, when I speak to regulators in other countries, myself or through partners that we're working with, they tend to talk pretty regularly with Health Canada, with the Canadian regulators, right? So they look at Canada as a model. They don't necessarily think of the U.S. as a model because it is so state specific. And even though there's 33 states now with medical programs and 10 with rec, it's siloed, right? Each state operates very independently. So, we are, Germany, Australia, and even countries like Singapore now are looking at medical programs, right? So I think the market is going to grow, and Canadian companies are in such a phenomenal position to take advantage of it. But to Peter's point, you've got to do it in a measured way. You want to go in and work with the right partners that have the right connections and the right expertise in the market. And I think that approach is going to pay off in the long run. I've built global companies before. My experience has always been finding the right partners in different countries that understand the regs, understand the local kind of culture, and work closely with government, especially in such a heavily regulated industry.
Just giving a concrete example of one of our relationships, picking up on this comment, is we've got a minority stake in a company called Stenocare in Denmark.
I was just going to ask you, both of you have strategic investments in Europe, so I wanted to go. Please give us an update on Stenocare.
Yeah, in fact, the Stenocare, the principals of Stenocare were in our office on Monday. I spent the day with them, which was very, very exciting to spend some time with them. But to the example that was just given, so Stenocare was really one of the very first in Denmark in terms of providing medicinal cannabis. We supply them with oil and soon to be capsules, but they were the first in the European market to do an IPO. So they were the first cannabis company to do an IPO in the European Union, which was very successful, oversubscribed. But what's more important was it made them the leader in the space in the European market. So all the regulators are coming to Denmark and coming to Stenocare to ask them how they do things, how they think about things, which relates very much to what we're doing here in Canada. So I think Canada's leadership in cannabis gives us a position. Also our reputation as a country in general, right? I think give us the opportunity to really be a global leader and influence the way cannabis is perceived and done across the globe. So right. I think that's one case study.
And just switching, because both of you mentioned Cannatrek, can you give us a little color on your investment in Australia?
Yeah, so Cannatrek is a company that we've invested in. They are in many ways like a CanTrust, just in earlier days. So they're building 1.7 million square feet of greenhouse space. They're using our standard operating processes, and we're trying to help them and educate them to show them what we've done in our space so they can replicate it. So it's a very, very exciting opportunity. I believe their plan also is to IPO sometime in the future to capitalize that business. And we see it as strategic because it really is for us and for Stenocare in Australia a gateway to the Asian market, which is speaking very, very rapidly about legalization of cannabis in different forms.
Do you have an estimated cost per gram? I mean, I know they're still under construction, but when you look at all the costs, what's your goal of cost of production there versus in Canada?
Yeah, so I don't know the answer to the question. Okay. I mean, our hope is that our high-end greenhouse capability, I mean, we can be producing cannabis somewhere in the 75-cent range and to very, very high quality. Mm-hmm. Our view in the end of the day is this is in many ways going to be commoditized, particularly for the CBD market. Right. And we've got a view, and that's why we talk a little bit about beginning the work on outdoor growing to drive that cost much lower into the sub 30-cent range.
And I think you're one of the very few. We're going to get back to you, Greg, I promise. Okay. But you're one of the very few Canadian LPs that have regulatory approval for outdoor grow at this point. Is that correct?
I can't speak to the approvals that others have.
Yeah.
I'm not sure.
There are very few, although people are looking at it. But I think you're one of very few, so it should drive the cost down. Greg, looking at Europe, you've made an investment in Aviana, which is a CBD, a hemp oil producer. Can you talk to us a little bit about where you are? I know we've had discussions with your team.
Sure.
They've been over both in Europe, and then the European team has been back learning from your Moncton facility.
Right. Yeah, so Eviana's traded on the CSE. It's a publicly traded company that has actually been producing hemp with a high level of CBD in it, kind of that 4 to 6% range, for 3 years now, actually, in Croatia and Serbia. The area that they're in is Serbia is known for centuries of hemp production. So we look at that as, to Peter's point, it's a low-cost production area. It's a low-cost sourcing area. And so now they're moving towards, they are doing extraction at this point. They're scaling that up. And, we really see that we have access to 25% of their offtake at a discount to market price. And when we see right now is there's again, the supply doesn't meet the demand in Europe on CBD. So it's a way for us to take that product, to brand it for the European market, and to really position ourselves in multiple European markets. So that's part of our strategy there. And, I mentioned Alpha Cannabis as well in terms of how we're approaching Germany. And, we also are looking at are there other opportunities to continue to move into that marketplace? And I think, the key in doing that is always finding the right partner, as I said before. Sure.
So switching to another country, a little more sensitive. Let's go south of the border to the U.S. Big electoral change in the U.S. There's certainly more progressive legislation on the way with respect to legalization, whether it's the States Act, the Farm Bill, ultimate federal legalization in the U.S. Neither of you have operations in the U.S., but how does the political winds changing in the U.S. affect either of your companies? Greg?
Yeah, I think so. Certainly, we need to continue to follow and look at the U.S. and follow it closely, right? I think there's a tremendous opportunity there, and as legislation changes, and the Farm Bill certainly is one part of it moving forward in terms of potentially allowing CBD hemp production on a more kind of routine basis across the United States, and the States Act, which will change the whole banking structure and the difficulties that U.S. companies have today. But I think between those two, it's still a ways to go before you get a federal legal program, right? And I think that's one of the things that we aren't sure on what that timing looks like. I think we're prohibited as TSX traded companies to invest in the U.S., but we continue to follow it closely. And certainly, we need to be looking at that as a market as things start to progress. Is that a market we want to enter? How do we enter it? We certainly, have engaged in multitude of discussions with U.S. companies of, how would you go in? Do you partner with them? How would that look like? But I mean, certainly those are all just theoretical discussions at this point, because again, we're prohibited from entering the space. I think one thing that's going to be interesting with the U.S. is that, as I said earlier, one of the challenges they face is that the companies today, even those of scale that are in multiple states, they're still only vertically integrated within the state. Right. So they're actually doing things at a much smaller scale than we're doing today. So the operational and the IP experience that Peter alluded to that we have today is easily transferable in the U.S. and can actually give Canadian companies an advantage entering the U.S. if and when that market opens.
Sure. Just got a couple of questions looking at the U.S. and Mexico. Any comments on looking at production out of Mexico from either, or what those implications are?
I mean, maybe I'll make a couple comments. I mean, certainly we continue to see Canadian companies looking at equity investments in potentially low-cost jurisdictions or others as I think one of the things you have to consider when you look at production, so certainly movement within the EU is pretty straightforward, right? Movement within Europe. If you were investing in a Latin American country, you should be able to move product within LATAM. I think when you start to think about product moving, we've yet to see product from Uruguay, for example, move into another market. And I think, there's two aspects to this, right? There's, 3 UN conventions, the INCB oversees this. They have very much real concerns about, a global drug trade. So today they allow movement of product for medical. but it's still very restricted. So I think the opportunities for that still will continue to be restricted, and especially when you have some geopolitical issues coming up where Russia is making this a big issue in the UN and kind of trying to push back on it. I mean, certainly, China, Middle East, and a few African countries have commented on it and kind of have issues with what's going on. So I think you can't guarantee and bet on, some of that product moving. Will it happen 5 years, 7 years? Maybe, but certainly from a recreational market, I don't expect to see product ever moving in the foreseeable future. Again, it could be in the future, but on the medical side, it's still difficult to tell, right? There's still very much concerns. You've got to follow, I know Canada in the process to get the INCB on board with our program for adult recreational use, had officials from INCB spend time in Vancouver and actually looked at what was happening, and it was in the best interest of health of Canadians to have the program put in place.
Right.
But when you start to talk about a global drug trade, that's a different conversation.
Sure.
So.
Actually, that whole question about Mexico and Latin American countries in the U.S., I actually think that the biggest takeaway that I took for me is, yes, legalization can happen at a federal level. Everyone can change their rules about medication, about medicinal and recreational, but how product crosses borders, I think, is going to be very complicated, and it's going to take some time, a significant amount of time. So pure legalization doesn't necessarily change much from a Canadian perspective in the medium term.
All right, excuse me. Sorry. We have a question from our viewers. There was a news report over the weekend that a Canadian had crossed the U.S. border in BC, and they were banned, lifetime banned from the U.S. for simply investing in cannabis. Now, I think I'm going to correct the viewer because it wasn't just investing in cannabis. Right. The person was actually going to the U.S. to do business in the cannabis industry in the U.S. And I think there's a big difference between Canadians investing in Canadian companies and Canadians going over the border to invest or be actively involved in U.S. businesses. Be that as it may, do either of you have a comment for our viewers in terms of things that people should take precaution when they are traveling, because the U.S. takes this very seriously, and you need to answer the questions honestly, but this is obviously a very important topic for Canadians. I think personally the federal government hasn't been clear about what travelers should be thinking about.
Well, it's a challenging question. I actually is what I find so interesting about the space is how the rules and the regulations are continually evolving and changing, and there's a lot of ambiguity. So you're never 100% sure, which makes doing business and business planning challenging. And I think this is just another example of that. I think that the Department of Homeland Security has issued certainly a view on this, and that as long as the business of cannabis is federally not lawful in the United States, you're not allowed to be in the United States doing things in furtherance, of the cannabis business. So, so I think we have to be very cautious about going to the U.S. and to do stuff related to the cannabis business, but also lying is totally unacceptable. So it's a difficult challenge, and you hear lots of stories of what people are willing to do, to try and work through that gray area. But I think just in the short term, we have to be very, very cautious.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I'd add to that. U.S. Customs, Border, and Security has been very clear and transparent in terms of, again, no one should give, no one should lie. They should not give misinformation. I mean, that puts you at risk, at greater risk than kind of. So what's clear to date in their position is that people working in the industry that are investing in the industry in a legal manner in Canada should not have any concerns. So investors that are investing in Canadian companies should not have any concerns about going to the United States. The comment you make is about this one individual that was reported on. Again, they're investing in a U.S. company where it is federally illegal, and I think that's where some of the concerns become. we've had staff and consultants that we work ask questions, kind of go through that kind of secondary screening. But at the end of the day, there's been no issues with them crossing in the border, and they're not been flagged for future travel in any shape or form. So it really comes down to potentially, Canadians investing in U.S. companies, and there seems to be some prohibitions and some restrictions on that.
And I might add, it's okay for Canadians to own Canadian mutual funds too.
Yes,
of course.
Absolutely.
Just want to make sure everybody knows that.
Absolutely.
Want to talk about strategic investments because we've got Molson Coors setting up a JV with Hexo, and we've seen Constellation Brands obviously injecting $5 billion into Canopy. Investors, people in their offices want to know, what's your view of the next area of strategic investment? It's obviously, to date, mostly on the beverage side, but when does Big Pharma get involved?
Yeah, maybe, I mean, Peter can certainly speak. CannTrust has an agreement already with a pharma company for development, right? So they're already in the space, and one of the other companies, Tilray, has an agreement as well. So, so there are right now some work going on the R&D side. I think when I came from the biotech and pharmaceutical industry, and certainly I think when those industries look at the space, it is a threat and kind of a threat to their business, but they tend to very much follow an IP model, right? So what's the intellectual property, what are the patents they can get, and that's kind of the key aspect for them. So I don't expect them to be first movers in terms of any continued kind of aspect in terms of strategic partnerships. Right. I think there are, there's been lots of rumors out there, but I mean, there are companies that are doing diligence to look at opportunities, and but I would, to put a time frame in and what that looks like is impossible to say right now. I think there's, there's lots of opportunities. I think if we think you've got to think globally, B, you've got to think this isn't just a cannabis market, this is a CBD and cannabis market, then you start to expand the potential portfolio of strategic investors that would be interested or look to come to the space.
Yeah, I would say we have conversations on a regular basis with companies in basically any vertical that you can imagine who are very, very curious about cannabis. They understand the impact it's going to have on many, many different verticals, whether it's over the counter, whether that's natural healthcare products, whether that's the pet market, whatever, all the verticals, right, are going to be impacted. So we have regular conversations with these people. I think that they're very, very curious, and they're not exactly sure the role it's going to play and what the timing is. I do see this having a material impact on pharmaceuticals, but that, as you said, they're watching very, very closely, and in some cases partnering, and like with us and our relationship with Apotex, and it would be very interesting to see what they do, but I don't see anything happening in the short term.
And maybe I'd add, Charles, that we've seen two significant investments, or one significant investment and one JV with Molson Coors and Constellation. And again, in many ways, those have been protective moves, right? So we know that alcohol beverage sales decline when cannabis legalization comes online. We've seen that in U.S. states. We've seen an erosion of their markets. So those have been very much, are they opportunistic moves? Yes, but are they also defensive postures? And that's kind of been, it's a bit of a combination of both, right? In terms of, they are going to lose share to cannabis and cannabis products. And what's interesting, and a lot of people don't talk about this, a lot of the modeling that was built out for Canada is based off U.S. state data. And alcohol beverage prices in Canada are much higher for consumption than they are in the U.S. Cannabis prices are not. So we actually could potentially see more conversion into the cannabis space from a costing perspective, right? What do people have in terms of their pocketbook and their spending ability versus alcohol? Because alcohol prices can be 2 or 3 times higher here for the same product.
I would also say that when we look at these partnerships, yet they're sexy and they're exciting, and people like to talk about them. But certainly the conversation we're having inside the walls of CannTrust is we find some of these partnerships, if they're too big, can be very limiting, because cannabis has application in many, many, many different verticals, right? And to be controlled or unduly influenced by one of them certainly is very limiting. So there's real opportunity cost over time about those types of partnerships.
Right. We only have about 5 or 10 minutes left, so just asking you a couple of individual questions. It seems like we could go on for hours, and I appreciate your time. Peter, wanted to talk to you about Niagara and cultivation right now, and where you see driving revenues going forward. You've just announced a stellar quarter last week. We're not just talking up our book, but I think everybody knows that CanTrust and Organigram are both primary holdings in our portfolio. So glad to see both revenue generation, positive cash flow, and control of G&A expense, where we've seen that flourish with other companies. What's next in the coming quarters? Where are you driving revenue?
Yeah, so today, primarily our revenue is driven by what we now have is 53,000 medical patients. I mean, that's predominantly the revenue that we've seen in the past. And our number one priority has been to our patients, and we can't let them down, and that's why we want to continue to grow. So we see that in the foreseeable future. We've seen exciting early days from our recreational side. But when we think about the continued going forward, we're working on increasing our grow capability. So our Niagara facility, we're actually quite happy with how that is going. We do have aspirations to do our first outdoor planting in the spring to see how that goes, which will hopefully in time drive costs down. So we're one thing about CanTrust is we're very focused on the fundamentals of the business. So watching those expenses, focusing on our patients and our new customers, and continuing to grow revenue. We believe over time, for you and for our investors and us, that steady predictability is going to be fundamental. So we're in this for the long run, and we're trying to deliver results on a consistent basis.
Great. And equally important, although your quarter's coming up soon, most recent quarter was also very strong, as you mentioned. Lowest cost per gram in the country of all the public companies at 80 cents a gram. The multi-tiered operations indoor, you're getting premium product, premium pricing, yet lower cost. It's a great combination. But one thing I want to allow you to speak of that we have not yet is biofermentation, because here we are talking about cultivation, and yet here's the next step in terms of scientific venture that, if successful, has dramatic implications for your revenue and your earnings.
Sure.
Do you want to talk about Hyacinth?
Yeah, so we made an equity investment in Hyacinth. They're a Montreal-based biotech company that's developing biosynthesis production of cannabinoids. So taking the gene for olivitol, which is the precursor molecule to CBG and other cannabinoids, and inserting that into yeast and growing it up in fermentation vessels, and then converting that into CBG, CBD, THC, and now they're working on some minor cannabinoids as well. So, they've got proprietary enzymes, and they've proven this at a small level production. So now they're moving into commercial production, both with building out their own initial facility as well as using a contract manufacturer in parallel. And we expect them to be producing commercial product within 12 to 15 months. So what that means is this has the potential to be a very disruptive technology, right, in terms of displacing the industry. And for people that don't know biosynthesis, more than half the world's insulin is produced in this manner. ASA is produced this way. Many vitamins are produced this way. It's a proven technology. And again, the work that they've done to date has shown that they have a capability to do this. Now we're in a scale-up mode. So, I think we see that whether or not you're talking about an API or active pharmaceutical ingredient for pharmaceutical products, or you're looking at beverages, edibles, vaporizable products as an input material for that, right? So, and potentially they're in a position of producing this for pennies on the dollar versus plant-derived, right? So, great investment, work closely with them. We looked at a number of different players that are working in that area, but the fact that they're Canadian, they had proven this, and that they're already capable of producing, not only CBG and CBD, but THC as well, was very exciting for us. And it's a great team. I sit on the board of the company, and it's a great group and a great group of scientific advisors that have proven history as well. So.
Actually, it's an interesting approach because we've chosen a different approach to that same evolution, right? Which is we have PhDs in nanotechnology that work with us. So we're still working on the grow side, but increasing the bioavailability of the products. So in the future, for medical purposes or for extracts and edibles and those types of things, ultimately, we should be able to be using a tenth of the ingredient, for example, to get the same impacts from a medical perspective or from a recreational perspective. So different approaches, but certainly headed in the same direction.
Looking for the same goal, that's right. Just wanted to ask a clinical trials question. CanTrust is involved in many clinical trials. As we've seen with Epidiolex, which is a GW Pharma product, got FDA approval in June for controlling seizures from childhood epilepsy. Is CannTrust looking short-term, long-term? What's your assessment of when some of your clinical trials will be ready to go to Health Canada?
Yeah, so we have a variety of clinical trials. Right now we're doing one with McMaster University testing our CBD oil on the treatment of pain. We're also doing one in Australia, which is very exciting to hear about the effects that cannabis can have on ALS and ALS symptoms. So there's a little bit of time before these things have to happen, before we actually get the results and we can submit to Health Canada, but I think probably in a relatively short window. We're very excited about this because for the ubiquitous sort of acceptance and understanding and adoption of cannabis for medical purposes, this type of work needs to continue to happen.
Great. And I know Organigram in our 1 or 2 minutes involved in Atlantic Canada and the federal government with a genome project.
Yeah, so we're working with UDM, University in Moncton, that with Genome Canada and ACOA and a multitude of factors come together. So it's both looking at genomic mapping of cannabis plants to also look at can you go through a program to produce plants that are more specific for different, whether or not they're minor cannabinoids or terpenes or products that have a clinical effect. I think that's one key aspect. We're also looking at kind of non-GMO impact on plant life. So very common practice in other agricultural practices is to actually take biological additives and seed the soil with them and actually see the impact, and you can see in other plants. So there's a number of different projects with this, and we're really excited to be partnering. And again, it's a group of, not only just the local university, but Genome Canada and COA coming together under one umbrella. And so we've dedicated space in our facility for their research. So exciting project for us.
Fantastic. Well, thank you, both of you, for joining us for this hour. As people could see, we could probably do this for another 2 hours and take more questions. We appreciate everyone's questions, and I appreciate your time. It's really been insightful. I want to thank, obviously, Peter Aceto, the CEO of CannTrust, Greg Engel, the CEO of Organigram. We appreciate having you to take your time today to do this. Just for our viewers, the recent market pullback offers unique opportunities to invest. We believe that the best way to invest, the way that provides upside while reducing risk and lowering volatility, is through an actively managed approach. Year to date, our fund is up 27%, and we're generating that return with less than half the downside of a passive strategy. What we've found in our years is people like the upside. They're not too thrilled with an immediate downside. So we suggest you take a look at the Ninepoint Alternative Health Fund. If people watching have follow-up questions on our fund or on CannTrust or Organigram, please don't hesitate to contact your regional Ninepoint sales rep. They'd be happy to help. And on behalf of everyone here, I'm Charles Taerk. Thanks very much for joining us. Have a great afternoon.